second set of questions actually asks you to dive a bit deeper into your research by maybe giving us 2 or 3 stories about how did you your study explored cities as sites of contestation. We know that there are a lot, you mentioned many of those, there are a lot of actors, institutions, systems, infrastructures that come into place and that seek to govern the city, often to capture it and redistribute trends and to advance power interests. We heard this in different ways through your introductions. We also heard about how dwellers and also workers have to navigate these configurations of power to access services and livelihoods, some trying to benefit from the rent capture that exists at higher scales, or to benefit from some form of social capital, while I think a big majority merely struggles to survive day to day and even half day to half day with the aggravating conditions of inequality. My question to you is to how your work illustrates these shifting configurations of power and their dynamics in these contexts of aggravated inequalities, crisis, and violence that you each mentioned in their own context of study. So I will give the floor to maybe Rafif to continue building on what she started with, and so we stay with your framework, and then we move to Omar and then Sarah, perhaps.
Great, thank you. So one thing I want to pick up on is the idea of crisis itself, because I think nowadays we're using the word crisis very often. I live in the UK and everything is a crisis constantly. So I wanted to pick up on the idea of crisis itself, of crises being moments that are extremely malleable, where things can go in any direction. They ultimately represent malleability, fluidity, and they are frequently seized upon as moments for capitalist states and powerful actors as opportunities to restructure. This includes restructuring the urban environment and to push forward change in ways that were previously foreclosed. So since the 2011 uprisings, there has been this idea of within, at least a motif within international financial institutions, that there is the crisis in the region, the crisis of the model that has existed, is an opportunity. But they see it as an opportunity to push forward even more market solutions. The World Bank and the IMF have very clearly said that the problem was there wasn't enough market in the Middle East, and if we could push more market solutions, that will be the best outcome that can happen. This includes further integration of the region into international trade and logistics chains. So we are speaking about the usual export-oriented model of development, but here it centers around what has been called infrastructure-led growth, that the best way for the crisis to be resolved is to put more money and more investments into trade infrastructures, be it maritime ports, be it airports, basically extractivist infrastructures that would make extractivism easier and to flow a lot. So you will see a lot of projects across the region that are particularly trade infrastructures. There hasn't been a lot of work that actually triangulates how these are working together. So one of the areas I've been looking at is around food. And I think if we're going to study the city, one of the key questions to ask is, where is our food coming from? How is food being structured? One dynamic happening around the region is that food and logistical chains are intersecting in such a way that the majority of the food is for export-oriented. So export-oriented production. Already on a regional scale, much of the food is imported to our region. And we see when something like Ukraine happens, it impacts the region very strongly. When we then orient the economies fully for trade and for these food infrastructures to go for export, it really changes how we live the city and how we access our food, our daily incomes. So to me, the question of food regimes and how it's intersecting with these infrastructures is really important. A lot of silos are being constructed around wheat farms, for example, that then connect directly to new train investments that are being linked directly to ports. So the question of food security has been criticized, and the concept of food security has been largely criticized. We are yet to see a lot of studies around how food and logistics are intersecting on a regional scale. Another area that I think is really interesting, again, is this question of humanitarianism and logistics. And here, I think the story of Dubai Humanitarian City is a very good one around how an opportunity, destruction on one side is actually opportunity on another side of the region. So Dubai International Humanitarian City allows for the United Arab Emirates in particular to position itself as a stable location within the region that can use its logistical network in order to supply logistical humanitarian support. Dubai International Humanitarian City is actually the hub of humanitarian logistics within the entire region, yet hardly any of us hear about it. Most of us don't know how it functions, although the majority of the big United Nations agencies are actually stationing all of their logistical supplies there. So back to this idea of crisis as opportunity, in this case, the displacement crisis that we have in the region was actually utilized by states like the United Arab Emirates as an opportunity to sell themselves, while at the same time really sealing the country from accepting refugees or accepting a large refugee population. And one last thing I will say is, again, an area that I think we all need to be investigating a lot more is this concept of smart cities and the transition towards smart cities that we are seeing very aggressively. Because I look at the United Arab Emirates, you really see this extreme push towards smart technologies, smart cities that are also intersecting with climate action, with green technologies. And here there's many questions around surveillance, how it's being structured and how it's working through these smart city technologies. Particularly if we look politically at moves toward normalization with Israel, looking at the United Arab Emirates and normalization with Israel, we see how these surveillance technologies are circulating on a regional scale. So I think there's certainly room to dig a lot more deeply into smart cities and how they are impacting the region as a whole, and how these technologies are being perpetuated to increase surveillance at the same time under the guise of being also climate smart technologies.
Yes, greenwashing narratives in action. Thank you, Rafiq. Omar, would you like to share with us your thoughts on this?
Yeah, on the question, not on Rafiq's work, which would require a completely separate presentation, which is all fascinating and super important, especially on this notion of crisis, which we should talk more about. So to the question, so I'll try and give I guess a two-part answer, or kind of two distinct things to talk about to this question that I think speak to the complexity inherent to what I think the question called configurations of power, at least in Baghdad. First, during part of my research into checkpoints in Baghdad, I was able to carry out in situ observation at two different checkpoints, one operated by federal police in the Karada district in eastern Baghdad, or just east of the Tigris River, and a second operated by Iraqi soldiers in the Mansour district in western Baghdad. One of the conditions or practices immediately apparent to me during this research, which will come as no real surprise, I think, to the city's residents, are the ways in which these installations are classed. The vehicles most often stopped for secondary inspection as they were passing through were occupied by lower income residents of the city, usually identifiable by the model and condition, the model of the kind of the vehicle, the condition of the vehicle that they were driving or riding in. These checkpoints, once numbering some 1,500 across the city at their height, were central to an urban counterinsurgency strategy introduced by the US, of course, and kind of taken over by the Iraqis, a socio-material tactic on which authorities and security commanders incessantly doubled down on for the better part of 2 decades. But as Ahmed, a police officer at the checkpoint in Karada, would often say to me during my research, during this time at the checkpoint, checkpoints only hurt the poor. He would always say to me, checkpoints only hurt the poor. While lower income residents were persistently held up at these checkpoints, members of parastatal armed groups, once known as militias, were always given free pass through these checkpoints. Implicated in some of the most vicious violence perpetrated across Baghdad in the mid-2000s, only a few short years later, members of these groups began driving through the city, carrying with them letterhead embossed with their respective group's logo, and on which is written neatly typed vehicle information, along with the name of the driver to whom it is registered. The idea being here, they show the letter, and if they're even stopped, usually driving white SUVs with tinted windows, and if they were stopped, they show the letter to allow for laissez-passer. Somewhat separate here. Second, in the spring of 2019, security authorities abruptly shut the real estate registration department for the Mansour district of Baghdad. In Samiha, Tapo Mansour. The department maintains land deeds and property titles. When a property owner sells their land or their home, the sale is registered with the Tapo. All of these, all the information of who owns what land in this district is registered with the office. For years, Iraqis, for many, many years, Baghdad's residents, Iraqis in Baghdad and elsewhere, but we're talking about the capital, especially those who left the country during the worst of the city's post-2003 violence, have reported property thefts to authorities. This appropriation of people's homes and land occurs legally. That is, victims of this practice, which we can get into, essentially discover that the deeds and titles of their properties are no longer in their name. They no longer own their property. When they inspect and investigate how and why these the property titles are no longer, the property is no longer there, as registered in the Tapo, the one-time owners discover that forged documents, including personal identification, sometimes even their fingerprints, were used to essentially process the theft. Members of Baghdad's Christian community, many who fled the city because of identitarian violence, again in the mid to late 2000s, have been particularly affected by this practice. And there's an important piece in Deraj, for those of you who follow their fantastic news site, who they wrote a very long, exhaustive piece on this issue as it affected Christians, which you can check out. But the appropriative practice, what I would call an appropriative practice, actually crosses sectarian lines. And in Mansour, where the authorities closed the office in 2019, is, after all, home to a sizable Sunni community. Of course, we push back against these terminologies, for the record, these kind of very crude notions of identity in Baghdad. They've been rather destructive in the city and across the country, just kind of even speaking them into existence. But at the same time, when we speak of them, I think we need to reflect how these conversations even play out in everyday life. And this is kind of a fact that we have to think through, and harkens me to this new volume on by Stanford University Press that's just come out, called Practicing Sectarianism, which is focusing on Lebanon, but we talk about how that really addresses how we talk about how we deal with this issue of sectarianism, I think in a far more nuanced way than we've seen in the past. So just back to the story, a senior bureaucrat in Baghdad with knowledge of the events surrounding the closure of this office in Mansour told me at the time that in effect what occurred was an unrelated security operation, a raid on a home in a different part of the city, very, very far away from Mansour, led to the discovery of essentially a land theft ring in Mansour. What other pieces have since called land mafias. What he said to me at the time was, the home, this is a kind of quote, the home was strewn with documents from Tapo Mansour, he told me, adding, it was clear that the officials running the Tapo were in on the whole thing, working on the instruction of or in tandem with an influential armed group. Living with checkpoints and living with legalized land theft, essentially, may sound like distinct phenomena. And the takeaway here is not merely that both issues speak to conditions of everyday security and insecurity, kind of broadly defined. I think perhaps a bigger point or bigger takeaway rests with predictability. The presence and relative power of these actors, security personnel performing the state in the streets, parastatal armed groups, once known as militias, simultaneously embedded in the capillaries of state authority, while quite literally slipping through its grasp. These realities, far from any ideal political order, have become predictable to those who live with it. Perhaps another predictability being another measure of people's steadfastness or resilience, term I think is rather tired. At the same time, predictability does not preclude uncertainty. They are, in Baghdad at least, rather entangled. The predictable configurations of power in Iraq's capital city today do not so much demand some sort of anticipation of further physical violence for what's been called for wars yet to come, the context of Beirut. But they do suggest other forms of everyday social and economic violence that persist and perpetuate a lived uncertainty that I suspect is just as intolerable as any other form of violence. Thanks, Mona.
Thank you, Omar. I will refrain from commenting because it's so interesting to see what's happening at the micro level of how people are receiving these production of spatialities that Rafif mentioned and how they're living them through what you're describing, and that huge violence, actually you were just talking about it, that is experienced from the exclusivity of producing space for certain networks of people that do not live in these cities actually for most of the time. Sarah, take us to other terrains and let's see how to enrich this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you both. Wow, so much to think about and to think with. I guess I'll kind of focus in on where this project, what inspired it, and where is sort of what brought me to the study of the political in the first place, which is inequality, right? I was, living in Cairo, kind of seeing kind of a very just mind-blowing kind of inequality, and just, being in the city, and really kind of the brunt of neoliberalism in the mid-2000s. And from that kind of started graduate work in a political science department, really interested in these questions. And as I was interested in political economy, I also got fascinated with urban studies and what urban studies was doing, and felt like there might be something really interesting to see, or kind of how these questions merge. But I had several found several ways in which the different worlds didn't speak to each other, and kind of felt like there were really serious gaps in how we were conceptualizing inequality, conceptualizing these lived struggles. And the main ones were that as I looked at questions of political economy, it seemed to me that most of that field, not all of it, and I'll talk about the exceptions, were really kind of, as they were looking at neoliberalism, were really most interested in and going to familiar sites of redistributive politics, the sites of, thinking about subsidies, thinking about, subsidies is huge for Middle East studies, but mass housing, when you're interested in the city, rent control, things like that, which all are still really important to me as I look at these questions, but felt like they gave you circumscribed answers to what's happening under neoliberalism. And then when I looked at the study of the city, I felt like, and especially within the realm of the political, we were focusing quite a bit about sort of looking at the urban as a space of lived contestation, of lived struggle, of in the Middle East, the survival under authoritarianism kind of became really the rubric through which we were seeing the city, especially at the turn of the millennium. And that also felt a little bit like a little frustrating, because it felt like there were so many layers to the city that were not seen through this lens. And even as the built environment was important in that world, it felt like there was a way in which we were really kind of focused on a language of informality and so on that left so much space to think with. And especially as a student of the politics of expertise and science and technology studies, and I look at the architectural historians and what they were doing, look at all of that, I felt like there was a lot missing in how we were kind of bringing together experiences, but also the making of urban spaces in a political economic context. And then finally, the frustration with what I felt like a really interesting world of writing about neoliberalism through cities, but that took for granted kind of almost a defeat of a redistributive politics. And I wanted to sit and say, how did we get here? How did we decide that this is an entirely dispossessive project, and that there is kind of no negotiation of that in a neoliberal moment? And other than contestation on the margins. And I wanted to see if we could talk about contestation from within the project that I felt was really missing in that conversation. And that brought me, and these gaps and these holes really start to open up to me through many stages of the writing of this book. They don't come to me all together. I wish it was that magical and kind of straightforward, or maybe that wouldn't be quite as fun. But and through my work, I came to kind of look at ways that we can sort of bring different worlds together to address these gaps, address these questions a little bit differently. And here comes kind of where the book is intervening. And I'll use a very short anecdote vignette, ethnographic vignette, to kind of give you a sense of how I built my, the intervention. I know I don't have enough time to be reading or anything, so I'll kind of just jump right into it. So basically, my ethnography was looking at how architects and urban planners were transforming spaces in central neighborhoods and central districts in Istanbul and Cairo. And one of the projects I looked at was the Al Khan Foundation's project in Darb al-Ahmar in Cairo. And it was so interesting to me to see, we're looking at a project that is very much working with affordable housing, and you have almost sort of the project itself is not meant to be creating displacement, but we'll be talking about that a little bit. And so you have a lot of the same residents kind of staying through and seeing their homes being restored by the Al Khan Foundation. And so what I was interested in is how are these homes actually restored? And as I was studying that, I realized that so in several buildings, as I was talking to residents, I realized that they were having to share water pipes and water pumps. And it was really interesting because you had to coordinate with your neighbors about when you were using the water pump. And these are buildings that are just restored by the Al-Khan Foundation. And so I asked these residents, is this how it always was? And they said, no, actually the Al-Khan Foundation introduced these shared pumps, whereas in the past, we each had kind of control over our water in different ways. And I found that interesting, right? Because a lot of people were really thankful about the restorations, especially that they came through big grants, but were confused why, they were creating some of these things that seemed logistically more difficult. And so I asked the planner, right, what's the deal with these water pumps? And here is his quote. Quote, our purpose was that you learn to coordinate with your neighbors. So for example, when we installed water pumps, we would find that in a building with 6 residents, each of the residents wants to install their own. We would refuse such requests because if they can't resolve issues around using a water pump, then there's no sense in them restoring the house altogether. In other words, they have to talk to each other, end quote. Now, this was pretty interesting because I was expecting a very logistical answer, right? Like I'm going in, the architect is going to tell me there's no room for the water pumps or something like that, right? And and I got a political one, and I'm like, wow, all right, bring it on, man. So this was all about, building community in a way, right? So that really made me sit and think about the fact that what we're seeing here, and we see this over and over again in the book, is a project of social engineering through building design, right? And in a negotiation of the social engineering, because the residents are very active in the making of these spaces, that occurs. And that kind of brings me to, at first when I was writing the dissertation, I really focused in on the social engineering, but it was time, with time, I started to see it as part of a much larger market making project. And that's really kind of where the intervention sits, which is to argue that, as we're looking at things like the design of water pumps, it opens up seeing the political economy of neoliberalism in unfamiliar sites, right? What I'm interested in is what happens when you go to the spaces outside of kind of legislative spaces or or executive order spaces or wherever that the kind of we think redistributive policies are being made, and look at places like urban design. And instead, I'm kind of finding that this careful urban design is meant to actually manipulate real estate markets and property markets and battles for housing in Istanbul and Cairo through things like the production of community, the preservation of heritage, mitigating disaster risk. Right. And using all of those modalities, not just as revenue generators, as we've talked about for so long in urban studies, but as a place for intervening in a battle over housing. So both, protagonists who are interested in protecting affordable housing on the one hand, and protagonists interested in kind of cornering real estate markets for very heavy kind of capitalist accumulation are going to the subtle design of the building, not corruption on the one hand, not rent control, fighting for rent control on the other, to intervene in these struggles. And it's really kind of looking at the mechanisms through which they're producing what I call particularistic value for different neighborhoods that transforms how these real estate markets work altogether. And the idea here is that when we kind of see methodologically, right, bottom up, how the built environment and kind of social engineering, but politics around it is being transformed, allows us to see the market differently. And that actually there's a lot of contestation, a lot of political projects happening from within what we think of as market logics, and not just on the margins. And that's kind of where the intervention was going. But also the intervention takes us to the world of how do we think of where the political struggles are actually playing out in a neoliberal moment. And you see that so many struggles around identity politics and corruption and so on are playing out around the design of someone's balcony, someone's bathroom, right? Whether or not property deeds are being kind of rumors around whether property deeds are going to kind of bring back expelled populations from different cities, like especially minorities from Istanbul, for example. All of these dynamics produce kind of a repoliticization of all of that urban design that seem to really subtly kind of manipulate the market. And so again, produces a really interesting way of seeing that the political is actually being displaced onto these, you know, the burden of these political struggles being displaced onto these kind of minute crevices of the city, and are really difficult to recuperate then as a polity, right, in a public forum. So it then kind of stumbled on, well, should we be talking here about how we think about neoliberalism and populism or conspiracy theory, as a lot of the spaces that we used to kind of have for recuperating these political struggles are being displaced in other spaces. Anyway, so that's kind of where this project was going. I'll stop there about the book, and just make a couple of notes in relation to what some of Rafif and Omar were saying. As I was thinking about the second project and what Rafif was saying about smart cities, there's so much to think about here, and just kind of, you know, just starting out this project, I'm finding something really interesting about, you know, maybe just a plea for all of us to start to think about how our perspective around using things like IoT, Internet of Things, and smart cities and so on, is not just about kind of the collection of data, as you know, and really important dynamics of surveillance and so on, but also just how we're going to see the world in terms of aggregating how these data is being aggregated and how it's being manipulated. And I think a really interesting intervention here is Louise Amour's book on cloud ethics, which really pushes us to think about, you know, let's move beyond the privacy issues and think about that perspective change. So I wanted to kind of plug that in there. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you all.